My name is Clara Montgomery, and as a restoration architect, I spent my career designing structures built to withstand the harshest elements. I expected that my dedication would secure my place in the family legacy, completing the work my beloved grandfather started at our historic estate. Instead, I stood shivering in the freezing autumn rain, clutching my 7-year-old daughter Lily close to my chest as we watched my childhood home glow with the warmth of a celebration we were banned from entering. My brother, Julian, was inside, toasted by our mother as the mastermind behind my own blueprint design. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, her voice dripping with pride for a son who had done nothing to earn it. Julian stood beside her, soaking in the admiration of the elite, wearing a smug grin that masked a lifetime of theft. The injustice of that moment burned hotter than the cold wind cutting through my thin coat. I looked through the glass, trembling as I realized the depths of their betrayal. On the screen behind him were my designs, every line and every calculation I had labored over for years. My mother had spent a lifetime proving that my efforts meant nothing compared to Julian's comfort. I remembered sitting at my grandfather's mahogany desk years ago, watching his wrinkled hands guide mine over raw parchment. He taught me that a true architect leaves an indelible, unseen mark, pointing to the faint, embedded watermark in his custom stationery. That paper was my anchor, the foundation of everything he taught me about integrity and the legacy of our name. But Julian was always the golden child, shielded from every failure, while I worked late into the night to prove my worth. Evelyn often justified her favoritism with cold, calculating words, looking at my achievements as if they were merely expected. Your brother always needed us more, Clara, because you were strong enough to survive on your own. It was a manipulative explanation for her neglect, wrapping her favoritism in a false compliment that left me isolated in my own home. The betrayal first turned public months ago at the Montgomery firm's anniversary, where I expected to finally be recognized. Instead, Evelyn stepped up to the microphone, her presence commanding as she prepared to tear my life apart. With artificial regret, she accused me of plagiarizing my own brother's work, turning my greatest professional moment into a public execution. I stood frozen beneath the ballroom lights, unable to understand how the woman who raised me could destroy everything I had worked for in a single speech. Around me, conversations stopped. Colleagues who once praised my work avoided my eyes, as if my reputation had become contagious. When the guards took hold of my arms, I realized this was never about the project. It was about erasing me completely. Shaking and desperate, I ran back to the estate, hoping to find solace in the one place that was mine. My battered car felt like a fragile shield against the storm of my family's cruelty. I sprinted toward the entrance, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to reach my grandfather's things, to touch the parchment that held the only truth I had left. But as my hands trembled against the lock, a sickening dread took hold. Even the keys to my own home felt like they no longer belonged to me. I opened the door to my childhood bedroom, only to find it completely gutted. The sanctuary where I had spent years dreaming of becoming an architect had been violated. The yellow walls my grandfather had helped me paint were gone, replaced by beige paint and racks of designer clothes for Julian's wife. Every trace of my presence had been scrubbed clean. I stared into the void of my former life. My mother had spent a lifetime proving that my efforts meant nothing compared to Julian's comfort, and here was the final proof. My childhood journals, my university awards, and my first physical models were piled in plastic trash bags in the hallway, discarded like worthless clutter. I frantically ripped at the plastic, finding my life's work shattered into splinters and soaked in caustic cleaner. They hadn't just moved my things, they had tried to destroy the evidence of my talent. I collapsed onto the cold hardwood floor, burying my face in my hands. The history of my life had been erased in an afternoon, and the agonizing pain made it difficult to draw a single breath. When Evelyn and Julian returned from the gala, there was no remorse in their eyes. They walked past me as if I were part of the trash they had already thrown out. Julian scoffed at my distress, looking down at me with supreme arrogance. "You were never an architect, Clara," he said. "You were just my helper." Evelyn stepped forward, holding the legal document that officially stripped me of my inheritance and disowned me. She dropped it on my lap like a final, heavy stone. They turned their backs and headed into the dark grand hall, leaving me alone in the doorway. I was a Montgomery no longer. Julian aggressively hurled my remaining trash bags onto the dark, rain-slicked asphalt of the street, while I watched from my car, paralyzed by the sight of my life spilling into the gutter. Our elite neighbors watched from behind their curtains, their silent judgment sealing my exile from the world I had fought so hard to belong to. My photos and papers lay submerged in the flowing rainwater. It was a complete emotional collapse, a dark night where I questioned if I had the strength to survive their cruelty. To seal the exile, Evelyn lit a fire in the stone urn, tossing in the family portraits. Watching my grandfather's image ash away was a wound, but in that fire, a resilient anger was born. They had stolen my past, but they would not steal my future. Truth was the one foundation they could never burn. The flames reflected in Evelyn's eyes as she watched the photographs burn. There was no hesitation, no regret, only satisfaction. In that moment, I understood that my family wasn't trying to take my inheritance. They were trying to erase my existence. I sat alone in the darkness, long after the flames died. For the first time, I stopped mourning what I had lost and started thinking about what I needed to fight for. The pain was still there, but something had changed. Beneath the grief, a quiet determination was beginning to take shape. For the first time since the nightmare began, I stopped seeing myself as a victim. I started seeing a path forward. Armed with a trusted forensic accountant, I began working out of a small rented office, digging through years of digital files. We discovered the depth of the betrayal. Julian hadn't just taken credit, he had systematically erased my existence from the firm's records. He had used my social security number to register my architectural patents under his own name, committing systemic corporate identity theft. The paperwork was cold and official, proof that my own brother had been planning this theft for years while I worked late into the night. We had the motive and the theft, but I needed the physical evidence my grandfather had promised me long ago. I retrieved a small brass key my grandfather had given me shortly before his passing. It unlocked a private safety deposit box containing his original, biometrically signed design journals and digital cryptographic keys. The true foundation of my work was safe, secured by the very legacy my mother tried to burn, marked with the watermark only I knew to look for. The dark path grew even more treacherous when the Montgomery lawyers realized I was fighting back. A process server delivered a malicious court injunction from my mother's attorneys, legally blocking my access to the Montgomery archive. It was a calculated strike, intended to paralyze my legal defense before I could even present my findings. Hours later, my phone rang, and Evelyn's cold voice filled the receiver, dripping with a new kind of malice. She told me that if I didn't drop the case, she would make sure the state decided I was too unstable to raise Lily. The threat of losing Lily shattered me completely. Justice felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. As I held Lily's stuffed bear, I realized my mother wasn't attacking my career anymore. She was targeting the one person who gave my life meaning. I sat on the floor of my cramped apartment, holding her favorite stuffed bear to my chest, wondering how a mother could weaponize a child against her own daughter. Looking at Lily, I realized this fight was no longer about restoring my reputation. It was about protecting our future. Hope arrived from an unexpected, powerful source. Harrison Sterling, the billionaire developer of the Sterling Plaza, was reviewing the technical schematics Julian had submitted. An astute collector of design, Harrison noticed structural anomalies and crude errors that did not match the brilliance of the master plan. To a man like Sterling, the submission was deeply flawed. He knew immediately that the person who signed the contract wasn't the person who understood the soul of the building. He questioned his team, demanding to know how such a prestigious firm could submit work so riddled with mathematical inconsistencies. He tracked the digital footprints back to my registered credentials and requested an urgent meeting to find the true author of the blueprints. I was at my lowest point, packing up my small rented office and preparing to disappear into the obscurity my mother had designed for me. When Harrison Sterling appeared in my doorway, I didn't see a savior. I saw the man who held the final piece of the Montgomery legacy in his hands. He didn't come with threats or legal papers. He came with a question that demanded the truth. I presented my grandfather's watermarked schematics. With Raoul Vance looking on, I showed him the physical evidence that had been my anchor for years. I provided the cryptographic design keys and biometric signatures, proving that Julian had committed systemic corporate identity theft to register my patents as his own. Harrison looked up from the journals with profound respect. For the first time in my career, my professional worth was seen and validated by a true authority. He looked me in the eye and delivered the verdict that changed everything. This work belongs to you, Clara. The contract is worthless without your signature. The climax arrived at the lavish charity gala. Evelyn and Julian stood before the elite crowd, ready to accept the award for a design they didn't understand. They stood on the stage, smiling for the cameras as they prepared to claim the glory for the Sterling Plaza. Evelyn spoke with her usual cold, artificial pride, never suspecting that her public ruin was seconds away. In the tech booth, Raoul sat ready. Tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring a truth that had been buried for years. With one final key press, the foundation of their lies began to crumble. Across the ballroom, powerful investors and city officials watched in confusion as the presentation suddenly disappeared from the screens. One by one, the fabricated documents were exposed. Every lie my family had built their success upon was unraveling in front of the entire city. The same people who once doubted me now watched in silence, forced to confront a truth they could no longer ignore. Across the room, faces that once admired Julian now reflected disbelief as the evidence continued to unfold. Harrison calmly presented the final piece of evidence, leaving no room for excuses, denials, or escape. Behind him, the screens displayed my original signatures, journals, and design records, the proof no one could deny. Every step toward that stage felt like a step out of the shadows they had forced me into. For the first time, I had nothing left to fear. As the handcuffs clicked shut, years of manipulation, theft, and humiliation finally came to an end. They placed handcuffs on Julian for corporate fraud and identity theft, while the peers who once whispered about me watched in shock. The aftermath brought a quiet, deep peace. With the Montgomery firm facing liquidation, Evelyn was forced to sell the family estate to cover the massive fraud claims. Watching my mother stand alone on that porch, I did not feel a sense of petty revenge, but rather a profound, healing release. I returned to the estate not as the daughter they had exiled, but as the woman who had reclaimed her own name and destiny. Harrison Sterling appointed me as the principal partner of his global architectural firm, ensuring my designs would finally stand tall under my own name. My professional worth was finally seen and validated by a true authority in the world of design. I dedicated myself to the work, knowing that every line I drew was a testament to the foundation my grandfather had laid. Together, we looked out over the city we were helping to build, a future designed with integrity and a shared vision of excellence. Months later, the autumn air was crisp as I walked up the stone pathway of my grandfather's restored estate. The house was quiet, no longer filled with the toxic whispers of the past, but with the soft laughter of my daughter, Lily. I pressed my palm against the cool stone, knowing the legacy was finally safe, built on a truth that could never be broken. I looked toward the horizon, at peace with the knowledge that a true architect leaves an indelible, unseen mark, and I had finally left mine.